So we're going to start our keynote lunch, and I'm just thrilled to be introducing Arjun Murti. He's a partner with Veriton, and he's going to talk about all sorts of things in the realm of everyone deserves to be energy rich. So with that, and without further ado, we have his bio and information in the booklet, of course. I bring you Arjun Murti.
Thank you, Kirby. It really is a pleasure to be here. I was talking to my colleagues here from Utah Gas over our lunch just now, and it's great to be back in Colorado. I actually, through a roundabout way, went to the University of Denver, and I've got a daughter who goes to University of Colorado, and that made it easy to accept Kirby's generous invitation. My career background is I spent the first 22 years as a Wall Street analyst, primarily at Goldman Sachs. So our job was to interact with all the major asset managers out there as an equity research analyst. I would talk to the Wellingtons, the Fidelities, the Capitals, the big mutual fund, pension fund, hedge funds of the world with the idea of what do we think about energy, what's the outlook for oil prices or natural gas or any of the other things, and which companies do we like or not like. So I was a sector specialist covering the companies. I did that for about 20 years, based out of New York. I still live in New Jersey full time. Somewhere at the end of that, they put me in charge of the research department. The idea of managing a bunch of other crazy analysts is the job that kills you. So I actually retired as a partner from Goldman in 2014 and got to see my 3 kids in middle school and high school, which I will tell you as a dad, best decision I ever made. And around that time, I also had the opportunity to join the board of ConocoPhillips, which I still serve on, and to become a senior advisor at Warburg Pincus. And it was kind of, my successor at Goldman will note that when I dropped coverage, when I passed on my coverage to him, oil was still $110. So it was at the end of that sort of 2000 super cycle, the China BRICS expansion and so forth. And we, of course, then had a bit of a downturn after that. And I'm going to get to that in my remarks. It was somewhere around 2020 where we had COVID and negative oil prices. But we also had the rise of, in Wall Street terms, ESG, energy transition, and, quote, net zero, as sort of the perspective was, this is the driver of energy. And there was a lot of that sort of narrative that I did not agree with. I think, and I'll talk about it, one can have all sorts of views on the environment and climate and net zero and emissions and what we should do or should not do. But from my perspective, that sort of net zero overarching objective that was being put out there, that I did not agree with in terms of how it was phrased. The idea that we were going to go out of fossil fuels, go only into renewables over some arbitrarily short time frame, I did not think it was actually going to happen. It motivated me to first start on Twitter, which I actually made friends with, was actually quite a bit of fun, but then moved to kind of a longer form publication on Substack, and it's called Super Spiked. It is for free. You all are welcome to subscribe to it if you like. And the idea was to talk about how we think about the energy macro. And I did appreciate that when I started that Substack, a lot of my former clients, some of these asset managers, as well as a lot of the CEOs of the companies I used to cover, they all sort of signed up, and it kind of motivated me to continue. Then my colleague and former Goldman colleague, Maynard Holt, started up Veriton. And the name Veriton stands for, it's Veritas Energy, truth and energy. And we're really trying to talk about how we think about this sector broadly speaking. What is the outlook for oil, natural gas, nuclear, coal? We heard about geothermal this morning and all the new technologies. We try as best as we can to not take some ideological view that this is good and this is bad. But really, what do we think is actually going to happen? And we try as best as we can to bring that sort of Wall Street analyst perspective to it, which is no one cares my personal opinion on any of this stuff. What is actually going to make money? Where are the economics good? Where are they poor? What's the outlook for any of these commodities? And what are the companies you should invest in? Our business model at Veriton is one of dealing with generally the executive office, the CEO, CFO, head of corporate strategy at some of the largest companies you can think of, the big super majors, down to some smaller producers. We do across the value chain, upstream, midstream, downstream, oil services, and increasingly power infrastructure, and that whole part of it. It's been sort of rewarding to have some of the big tech companies and big industrial companies sign up for us. I think it shows the convergence and broadening of energy understanding that's going on. And then we also have kind of a venture capital PE fund that focuses in on a lot of the new technologies. But I really wanted to talk today, and Kirby asked me to speak to you about how we're thinking about the energy macro. And again, our critique of this idea that oil and gas is Republican and renewables are Democrat is something we instinctively do not understand in the least. And I heard it this morning. I really appreciated the comment that geothermal appears to be bipartisan, which I agree with. And I think nuclear fits in that bucket as well. And the question really is, why aren't they all like that? An energy source or technology should not be inherently partisan. They all have pros and cons, and there are choices that you make locally, at the country level, and globally that impact everybody. One of my key critiques of that net zero environment is, again, whatever you think about the imperative to deal with emissions, the idea that the world was going to organize itself on counting CO2 never made sense to me. And the idea that oil demand outlooks or natural gas outlooks or any other of the different sectors, solar, wind, and so forth, that it was going to be sort of a carbon accounting of how companies should think about their businesses and how policymakers and politicians think about it, that we push back on. And my basic sort of observation is that, I'm very lucky. My parents came to this country in 1961. I was born in 1969. I was born American. I was born lucky. Right? There's 350 million of us. There's however many similar in Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. We are the lucky 1 billion people on Earth who use a disproportionate amount of the world's energy, and we get to take it for granted. We get to have debates about things like net zero and what emissions we have. And contrast that with the other 7 billion people on Earth who are using a fraction of the energy that we do, all of whom aspire to our lifestyles. Whether they get there or not, you can debate. That is part of what goes into our oil demand and natural gas demand forecasts, but the aspiration is there. Unfortunately, not every country has the kind of governments that enable economic growth. In fact, we should probably ask ourselves where we are on that as a country. But I think there's no denying the 1.4 billion people in China, the 1.4 billion people in India, and the 1.3 billion people in the rest of Southeast Asia, 4.2 billion people in total, are picking up and to the right economic growth and therefore energy demand growth. And they are going to care about how can they ensure their economies have sufficient energy. And today, and I'll get to it, the Strait of Hormuz, a big issue for Asia in particular. You can unfortunately debate the outlook for 1.4 billion people in Africa. I will say I've been doing this for 34 years. For the first time in my 34-year career, Africa is starting to bubble up in terms of being positive on oil demand revisions. That's a great thing. And it is countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Mozambique, Tanzania, and so forth, and we need to do more work in disaggregating it, that are showing some signs of economic life. Their oil demand has been flat for decades. It is deeply unfortunate when we think about the quantity of people and how little energy they use. And one of the greatest ironies of what I think is their resurgence, or their emergence really, is that I think it's coming from China dumping renewables in these African countries. Because you give people energy and you give them economic opportunity. No person cares what their energy source is. Nobody does. You might, as executives or policymakers of specific technologies, no one else cares. When I turn on the light, when I move my car forward, can that happen? It's all anyone cares about. So the idea that this one's better than that one and this one's better than the other one, no, again, is it available? Is it reliable? First and foremost. And I'll get to our natural hierarchy of needs. We do live in a world, and we're now going to call it, it'll be actually next week's super spike, geopolitical super volatility. And the essence of the idea is, as a country, you do care about where your energy comes from. So an individual doesn't care. As an American, do I sit there and say, well, how much of that gasoline is coming from Iran or Russia? You honestly do not do the math on that. But countries care, and they care for things like, is that a friendly country? Might they cut off supplies from us? That clearly is something we're seeing right now. And so geopolitical security becomes a big issue. So if you're an Asian country and you're not blessed with a lot of crude oil or natural gas, you're going to be highly motivated to figure out the next generation technologies. So I'll say at Veriton and myself, we have very positive outlooks for the future of the oil business, the natural gas business. I actually think the coal business, perhaps less so in the US, but more so in the rest of the world, continues to grow. But we're also positive on nuclear. We're also positive on solar and wind. and storage and other batteries and hopefully geothermal and some other things, because those Asian countries, when you look at how large they are and how little energy they use and how much economic growth they want to have, they are not going to be dependent just on Middle Eastern, or for that matter, US shale oil flows coming to them. They're going to want to have some security supplies. So this notion of geopolitical security is very relevant. I'm 57 years old. In my lifetime, there's been 3 major energy cycles. The first one was the 1970s, where we had the Arab oil embargoes. I was a kid at the time, but I do remember the sort of odd even license plates waiting in gas lines. It was a negative manifestation of energy. It was, someone took our energy away from us, and now we're suffering. That was the 1970s. And that mindset still pervades today. The idea that somehow energy is bad or it's negative. Most of the time, I don't have to think about it. And then when I do have to think about it, it's in a negative context. The gasoline price went up, or I have a blackout, or I have to do without it. And I do think that creates a challenge for energy companies. And maybe I'll talk about it later, but especially the leading energy companies, they don't have retail businesses for the most part. No oil company owns their gas stations anymore. And that need to communicate why we use energy, very few people do that at all, let alone very well. You actually in Colorado have the example of perhaps the singular American executive who did a great job. That's Chris Wright, our current energy secretary. And well before he joined this administration, his report, Bettering Human Lives, is absolutely the only report out there that explains why we use energy and why Liberty was doing what they're doing. And it talked about the environment and those challenges. Most other oil companies, their ESG reports are, well, Wellington and Fidelity want me to check a bunch of boxes. Here's my glossy brochure that tells you all why we're not as evil as you think we are. So Chris Wright was really one of the few people who could really articulate, here's why we use energy, and here's why Liberty is in the pressure pumping business as an example. You get to the 2000s, we had the second big super cycle of my lifetime. That was the China BRICS expansion. That was sort of my career-making call at Goldman Sachs. We were early in recognizing how tight oil supply was, supply-demand. It had been very loose after the 70s super cycle went into a bust. We were looking for a better outlook for China BRICS. It was the first time we had a positive manifestation of energy, which is it was economic growth, 1 billion people being lifted out of poverty that was driving oil prices higher. And I think right now here in the 2000s, we're in our 3rd super cycle driven by power. Power is driven by a number of different things. It's driven by aging grids in our country. It's driven by economic growth, both here and in the developing world. It is driven by AI and really digital transformation. And we can probably, with the Strait of Hormuz, wonder a little bit about oil's role going forward. But we're at a point where power is sort of the main driver of energy markets going forward. And then what are the technologies that feed it, and how does that vary by area? We're also seeing for the first time different sectors care about energy in a way they never have before. So I take a lot of hope in the fact that the biggest technology companies, the trillion-dollar behemoths, they care about energy. There are actually a couple of them are Veriton clients, which is crazy. Our background at Veriton isn't so much on the power side, yet they want to understand energy broadly speaking. Same with some of the biggest industrial companies. It gives me the most hope for this sector that the CEOs of the largest, especially oil and gas companies, they're never going to be, their nature isn't to talk in a public manner. Chris Wright is a real exception to that rule. But to have champions in the technology sector, in the industrial space, who can say, here is sensible and here's unsensible energy policy, their ramping up has been as impressive a thing as I've seen from where they were 4 or 5 years ago in understanding energy to where they are today. And this convergence of power and energy and industrial and technology is it's really one of the biggest changes in the course of my career. And the last area I'll just get to is in the age of AI. There's the Mark Andreessen line. He's the founder of Andreessen Horowitz, one of the largest venture capital firms. Software is going to eat the world. All anyone has to be is a software company, greatest thing in the world. On this graph, it's actually the white line. That's the software ETF, the IGV index of software as a service companies. And going back over 20 years, 25 years, they significantly outperformed energy and metals. That's the white line beating the purple and blue line. It's not a close call. Software is eating the world. It absolutely did. But today we're seeing that all software requires hardware. All hardware requires power, and all power requires raw materials like copper and critical minerals and rare earths, but also natural gas, nuclear, coal, solar, batteries. And that is the purple line is the metals line, perking up here, and the bluish line is energy. The world is recognizing this stuff just doesn't bubble out of the ground. You actually have to put investment into it. The graph on the right is just the energy sector versus the technology sector. If the line is going up, energy is outperforming. If the line is going down, energy is underperforming and tech is underperforming. We've been in, a 20-year period where tech has really dominated over energy. That has contributed significantly to the energy sector being out of favor. And here's where I will not agree that it was net zero and ESG for the reasons why energy's been out of favor. Energy being out of favor resulted in people believing in things like net zero, but it's not the reason it happened. This is a very long-term cyclical industry, as you all appreciate. The cycles tend to be 10 to 15 years up, 10 to 15 years down. I went through a couple of those super cycles. We had a big boom in the 2000s. It peaked in 2014. And then we had a really tough decade where the profitability, especially from oil and gas companies, but that's throughout the value chain, midstream, oil services as well, was really challenged. We had oversupply. We had too much shale relative to demand. We had investments in LNG projects and other things that had cost overruns in the 2010 period. And so we had a bust where profitability from 2015 to 2020 was actually 0%. And I feel like you don't have to be a Wall Street analyst to know 0% is a really low return on capital, right? And so will people say, why aren't we more popular? Why don't investors support us? It's because industry promised very high rates of return on the shale wells and delivered a zero. Zero is a really tough number. It's as low as it's ever been. You can take this data back to 1900, and zero is as poor of a profitability period as we've seen. And so a period where you had excess supply and where you had these, challenges of unfavorable profitability for companies, it enabled that rise of belief in net zero, belief in that ideology. I don't blame the ideology. Because when you think about the investor world out there, again, the Wellingtons, Fidelities, Capitals, none of us on Wall Street are ideologues in that sense. We might believe in sort of capitalism and that kind of stuff, but not in these other, climate or environmental type things. But it became believable to them. Oh, you know what? I don't really know whether, net zero is really the number one priority or not. But I do know that profitability stunk the last decade, and I do know it was boom bust. And I do know those big capital projects from the 2010s had poor returns. And maybe there is some debate about what's going to be the rise of electric vehicles and alternatives that might take away from oil demand. So they were willing to believe. They were willing to believe that maybe oil demand could peak and maybe it would decline. And all of that is fed to where we are today. But these cycles are boom bust and they're long term. It's not the first time we've seen the sector be out of favor. It's not the first time we've been sort of starved of capital to the industry. And I do think in that sense, the sort of climate and net zero overlay, it's an excuse often made by companies for why they're out of favor. I tell all our companies, what are your low-cost investments that are going to compete against other alternatives? What is your positive investment case to the investment community for why you should be owned? Who can deliver the message that Chris Wright delivered through Bettering Human Lives? Here's why energy exists. Here's why our company exists. Here's what we're doing to better human lives, but to also generate profits for investors. It's been a very challenging message for a lot of companies to deliver, and it's critically needed. One of the most remarkable things is one company, NVIDIA, is larger in market cap than the entirety of the US energy sector. That is the S5 ENRS. That's the energy stocks in the S&P 500. You can actually throw in materials and utilities, which I should do. I'm going to do that as an update. You're going to still get NVIDIA, one company being larger than it. And so we can debate whether that's an extreme or not. All I'd say is there is opportunity for capital to flow back in the sector, but it's not going to flow back just for the heck of it. What is the outlook for oil? What is the outlook for gas? What is the outlook for all the other technologies? And at the most important part, what is the ability for companies to generate a favorable combination of profitability and growth relative to that macro view? One of the things I think the world got sort of most wrong in the 2020 to 2023 period was they inverted energy's natural hierarchy of needs. Again, all anyone cares about, turn on the light switch, try and get your car to go forward. Does that happen? No one cares about anything else. Only people to me who really live net zero lifestyles are probably some monks and maybe other extreme religious figures. No environmentalist lives a net zero lifestyle. Certainly no executives do, none of you do, I don't. It is a luxury. It is a luxury that we get to debate it in this country. Not saying the debate shouldn't happen, I'm saying it is a luxury belief. Make no mistake about that. People actually don't care about, well, they will always prioritize availability. I lived through Hurricane Superstorm Sandy in New Jersey. Power was out in our house for 2 weeks. And you would have paid anything for energy at that moment. And we did. We weren't always able to, but we tried to. Affordability is secondary to is it there in the first place. That to have a healthy functioning economy, it does need to be affordable over time. But at the moment, you'll pick availability and reliability. One of my lines at Goldman during the 2007 supercycle, when the debate was oil and gasoline going from $20 to $100 a barrel and housing markets facing challenges, my comment was always, you can live in your car, you can't drive your house. And therefore, oil was going to be the one that's sustainable out of the two things. I believe that turned out to be true. Geopolitical security, again, no individual cares about it. At the country level, you care about it to ensure reliability and availability. I think the thing that especially, people in the environmental community might miss, clean air, clean water, 100% correlated with being a richer country. That's not even a close call. And it is true, if you care about biodiversity, which we should, if you care about carbon emissions, those are inversely correlated. I will argue, and I know this frustrates the climate activist friends that I do interact with on a somewhat regular basis, I don't think we can map out the path to zero carbon emissions. And the reason we can't is we don't know exactly which technologies are going to scale up to meet the energy needs of the other 7 billion people on Earth. Other 7 billion people. They have a really high motivation to not import oil they do not have. They have a really high motivation to not import LNG they do not have. And I think, especially with the new stresses brought about by this war in Iran, I think we will crack the code on more technologies. We spent a lot of our time at Veritas trying to study, again, geothermal, advanced nuclear, battery storage, all these things. But one of the, I think, mistruths of the last 4 years is that today we know all the technologies. If it wasn't just for those evil oil lobbyists, we could live in a glorious net zero world. That I push back on. That I do not think is truthful. The bottom left graph is one of the graphs that is one of my favorites and gives me the most hope. It starts when I was born in 1969 or 1970. It is the example of South Korea. They're a country that in hopefully half my lifetime, we'll see how long I live, they have gone from poor to middle income to rich. That is a great thing. In 40 years, you can do that. Everybody can do it. They did it. They're not blessed with tons of resources. They started off, those are per barrel and absolute levels of oil. And you can do energy overall. I've done oil. Oil is my first language, so I talk in oil units. They used 1.5 barrels per person in 1970. That's a poor country's usage of oil. We use 20. Canada uses 22. Europe's 10. Japan's 13. So 10 to 20 is where rich countries are at. They're at 1.4. They're now at 21, 22, South Korea. And they did it in 40 years. If you look at Thailand, they have not been as successful as South Korea. They're up to 6.5 barrels of oil per person. So they've kind of got a little bit stuck at that middle income level. And again, when you're a Wall Street analyst and you're trying to formulate outlooks, one of the things you debate, are you going to continue to get rich? Do you level out in middle income? Do you go take steps backwards? One of the debates. The thing about South Korea and Thailand is these are countries with 55, 75 million people, something like that. They're small countries. China is the first example of billion-person scale economy moving up and to the right. And China has gone from that typical poor country's oil usage, 1.5 barrels of oil per person, and they're up to just over 4 today. And at 4, they are by far the world's largest oil importer. And so the multiplier effect of having 1 billion plus people becoming wealthier is quite meaningful. China as a country is now at middle income levels. And there is a debate, do they get old before they get rich? So they have some demographic challenges. That is something I've been concerned about. I think when you look at China's dominance in manufacturing, their dominance in power, their actually competitiveness increasingly on technology, never mind traditional manufacturing, I think people have been too pessimistic on China, and I think they're going to be a very formidable competitor to the entire rest of the world. It's not the US against China. It's really which citizens get to have jobs, which countries get to generate tax revenues to support their economies and support the least fortunate through welfare payments and so forth. China is on track to do significantly better. And the question is, will we turn that corner? It started in 2015, 2016. It continued under Biden. It's continued under Trump too. It's been imperfect for sure, but the recognition, you just can't outsource and offshore everything and expect to have a functioning country. And we're going to see it right now in the war in Iran. The stuff we cannot make to replenish our stockpiles, the rare earths we don't process and mine, are going to be relevant to how this war settles out. And so credit to China. We can debate whether they didn't have great environmental rules. We can debate whether the Uyghur population wasn't treated well. We can debate lots of different things. They've got challenges, we've got challenges. Economically, they look great. They look great, and they are a formidable competitor. So all the choices you even make here in Colorado are relevant to how we do as a country from a manufacturing standpoint. Our key message is when you go from poor to middle income to rich, you don't use 15% more energy or 6% more, 3% more. It's 3x, it's 6x, it's 15x. You use multiples of the energy that you did before. And when you add up that developing world, 7 billion people, there's still a 3x to go. So when investors come to me and say, well, isn't it kind of a mature, dying business? I think there's no business with a more confident growth rate than energy, broadly speaking. And the growth rates not maybe as exciting as, say, AI or tech. They're 1%, 2%, 3%. For some of the newer technologies, they'll be faster, but there's a certainty to it. And there's a certainty that people doubted during the heart of the net zero era. So I want to go through the outlook of just first oil and gas, and just, again, really get to what people were debating and I think where we are. So the graph on the left is just oil demand. The black line is historical. And the green line were kind of the scenarios people are debating. In this and in the subsequent graph, the red line is the net zero scenarios. And you can see net zero literally assumed energy was going to fall off a cliff starting immediately. The graph on the right is rolling 10-year growth rates. The assumption in net zero was that oil was just going to immediately, completely fall off a cliff. And there are policymakers and people who actually believed it. Large parts of Europe have planned their economies on that kind of basis. The numbers are laughable. They're laughable. That assumes large swaths of humanity stays poor. And that is something I do not believe in. I think the good news about the rest of humanity is it's up to them. It is not up to us. It does not matter what we say as Americans or what any of you believe, as I presume overwhelmingly an American audience. If you're Western European, if you're Japanese, South Korean, it does not matter. China's pursuing the path they think is in their best interests. India, when my parents were born in 1939, they're still alive. They were technically colonial subjects. They do not think in those terms, just to be clear, but they were factually colonial subjects. There's no chance. India's going to say, oh, well, what does England think we should do now? They're going to do their own decisions based on driving their economic growth, based on driving the energy they need to power their economies. And so the idea that you're going to have the net zero line, that said those countries were going to choose to stay poor, no way. No way. The middle line, those are IEA numbers, I'm going to call the world's base case view. Even Wall Street people, most Wall Street people didn't believe the net zero line, but they believe the middle line, which is that oil demand would peak within a few years and then either plateau or fall off. Even those assumptions, you bring them out, assumes large swaths of humanity stagnate. And the idea that the world's going to stagnate, that is a really pessimistic worldview. That is a very sad worldview. That is people staying poor. There's nothing good about the environment of poverty perpetuating. And again, the good news is we don't get to dictate to them what they get to believe in. The top line comes from OPEC research. My own estimates are actually closer to above theirs, but even OPEC research I do think they should rebrand, by the way. They do some really good work. I've told them that. Even they had oil demand kind of leveling off by the time you get to 2040s. There's so much pressure when you're the CEO of these companies, when you're a Wall Street analyst, of just kowtowing, and apologies for the phrasing, global elite worldviews. There's a lot, like OPEC research. OPEC kowtowed to some degree to it, because that forecast that OPEC has still assumes a whole bunch of poverty that I'm going to say, no way that's going to happen. Certainly not for the 4.2 billion people of Asia. We might debate Africa, we can debate Latin America if we want. These are tough graphs to explain in a keynote presentation, but is the math behind why oil demand destruction is a concept that is not mathematically even close to coming true. So forget about the pictures. In the simplest sense, if you're forecasting oil demand, it's GDP times how much oil demand you use per unit of GDP. Just multiply those two together, you will result in oil demand. What then is relevant to are you on track for peak demand is what's the growth rate of GDP, and then oil demand per unit of GDP, what's the rate of improvement in that? And by improvement, I mean, it is a great thing. It's a credit to all of you in this room and many more out there that every year GDP grows a bit faster than the oil needed to generate that GDP. That is inherent efficiency gain. That is the great multiplier effect that enables societal wealth. The fact that your energy inputs do not grow as fast as the economic output they create. What the market assumes in net zero is that rate of improvement in efficiency, the aggregate metric, forget about, it does not matter whether it's electric vehicles or LNG trucks or miles per gallon, the red line, which is the efficiency gain, to even level off oil demand would have to be at this dotted line. To have negative oil demand, you'd have to be here, and you're not close, and you've never been close. The only time you were close was this period. That's also a period of 4.5% global GDP growth. The most recent period is 2.7% global GDP growth. Basic accounting, the net zero never made sense. Neither does the flat case. We're so far from it. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. It means the world's getting richer. It's a great thing. It's a great thing. It means air is getting cleaner and water is getting cleaner, by the way, too. And then we should be worried about biodiversity, and if you do care about carbon emissions, we can worry about that too. We are not close. The other point is simply, if you look at gasoline spending, this is America versus personal consumer expenditures. Gasoline over long periods of time underperforms the economy. Again, that's wealth creation. The energy used to create economic output, there's a multiplier effect. What that also means, though, is when you have periods of tightness, like we might be having right now with the Strait of Hormuz, if the supply is not there, it takes even larger spikes than you realize to knock out economic growth. It's really hard to kill gasoline demand. Because why would you stop driving? How are you going to get to this conference? Or if you could maybe avoid this conference, get to your job. And we live in a world where Zoom, you can work from home to some degree, but not if you work in the oil field. Right? The oil's not bubbling out of the ground naturally. You need actual people there who then have to get to that job site and to produce that oil and gas. That's true for a whole bunch of things. Less true in the white-collar world, more true in the people who actually do real stuff, which is make things. And so it is really hard to kill gasoline demand. And the basic point of all that is how you get to really high oil and gasoline prices to create the imperative to offset what might not be available supply. The natural gas outlook was even more ridiculous than the oil outlook. How do people have natural gas demand flattening out? This is global gas demand. The same graph, black line is history, red line's net zero. There are people who believe the net zero numbers that by 2030, global gas demand would fall 10%. And as you all appreciate, natural gas is used for many different things. It is power generation is part of it. It's heating. It's a bunch of different uses. It's got to compete on a price basis for sure. That's a separate discussion. But the idea, again, the OPEC research line, the one that has the most reasonable forecast, the top line, way too conservative. We're going to blow through these forecasts. And if we're going to have competition on manufacturing, and we should have manufacturing not just in Texas, we should have it here in Colorado, we should have it in New Jersey where I live. We're not on track for that in New Jersey. I don't know if you're on track for it here in Colorado. We shouldn't be sending California manufacturing to other parts of the world, but we're on track for that too. Look at Europe. UK is so proud they shut down their last coal plant. Well, by shutting that down, they've also sent all their refineries and petrochemical plants as well to China and elsewhere. It's nothing against China. China, it's not a critique of China, it's a critique of us. What are our policies to not allow that to happen? If you care about carbon emissions, how is that a good trade? If you care about the environment, how is that a good trade? If you care about human rights and labor, how is that a good trade? It's not a good trade. It is good that hundreds of millions of Chinese people are no longer poor. It's not a critique of China. They can run their country as they see fit. It's a critique of us. It's a critique of all of us. How do we let that happen? To me, the number one imperative to get off oil and gas as a country is sort of the import dependence. So this is oil imports. The dark blue line is the US. The light blue line is the US plus Canada. I'll probably talk about it less right now, but being integrated, US and Canada is really critical to our resilience as a country. Canada is a huge positive to our country. Certainly on the oil side, I think it's true of natural gas as well. China, the red line, look at their oil imports. China was actually a slight oil exporter before they decided to become a rich country. They had slightly more oil supply than demand. That's the red line. And they, at 4 barrels per person, remember, South Korea is at 22. We're at 20. Canada's 21. Japan's 13. Europe, that's 10 barrels of oil consumed per person per year. China's at 4. They're already importing 12, 13 million barrels a day. And China said, whoa, we're at 4. Thailand, which no one thinks of anyone's example of like a booming, strong economy. No one thinks Thailand's stronger than China. They're using 6.5 barrels per Thai person. That's 50% more than China. China's like, we don't want to get to where we're importing 60 million barrels a day of oil. And that is their push for electric vehicles and LNG trucks and renewables and critical minerals value chain and all those kind of things. And they've done a great job. They've done a really good job. And they're on track to export that to the rest of the world. And I will say, if they're exporting energy to the rest of the world, it's good for economic growth, it's good for oil demand, it's good for gas demand. I absolutely think the positive revisions in African oil demand are a function of renewables going there. So we should be happy from an economic perspective, China's going to export this stuff. But their challenge is, how do they stop having even more oil imports? Now look at India. India is already at 5 million barrels a day of oil imports, and they're barely at 1.5 barrels of oil per person. They're just starting in India. The difference is China's domestic oil supply is 4.5 million barrels a day, where India's is basically 0. And my example of sort of why we do spend a lot of time on new energy technologies is if India even got to 10 barrels of oil per person, that would be 45 million barrels a day of oil demand and 44.5 million barrels a day of oil imports. There's no chance India's going to go down that road. And there's going to be therefore a huge motivation. Now, if you're India, you want to import a bunch of cheap BYD and Xiaomi electric vehicles. Or do you try and create your own industry? It looks like they're having some success on solar panels. I think there's a huge, and India's also though following in our SUV path. And so I think there's a lot of policy choice that exists with India. A big one of them is going to be new technologies, which again, so we go about partisanship. I think it's ridiculous that Democrats try and keep oil and gas in the ground. It's similarly ridiculous for Republicans to not embrace all new technologies. Both sides are wrong. I might slightly prefer one side's rhetoric over the others. It doesn't matter. Both sides are wrong. And why can't we? Look at the success of Tesla. Why can't we export our leading technologies? Why wouldn't we want to export our leading technologies to the rest of the world? We're doing the rest of tech, right? Google, Microsoft, Amazon, these are the dominant tech companies. Capital markets, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, dominant financial companies. We are dominant in shale oil, shale gas. We should be on new energy technologies as well. So in terms of offsetting your imports, renewables are one thing. I will say what is relevant is how much does it make sense for your country? So in a country like India, which ironically is the lowest line here, I would argue that solar and batteries make a ton of sense in India. Not obviously it makes as much sense in northern Germany, but as a way to offset exposure to imported energy that you do not control, that is the case for renewables. It's a geopolitical case. I don't view it as a climate case personally. You never want 100% of anything. You certainly don't want 100% of renewables. The mistake to me Europe made is they used to be number one on nuclear generation. They're the light gray line. And for reasons I do not understand, they decided to close or shut in a whole bunch of them. Most notably, you see the line really dips off in 2020 to 2024. Germany, foolishly, is the only way to say it, shutting down their nuclear plants. We've stagnated. Look at the red line. That's China. And you go back to this one, the previous one. China's the red line, and renewables growing rapidly, nuclear growing rapidly. Look at coal. I historically have not covered coal. I said, all this debate about peak demand about 3 or 4 years ago, I better study when coal peaked. And when I studied it, it hasn't. We've declined. You can barely see it. The black line, the gray line, are US and Europe coal demand declining. It has been swamped, not even a close call, by China's coal usage exploding to the upside. China's growth in coal is like 7x the decline that we've had or Europe's had. And China is now 50% of the global coal market, and coal demand is only growing. So we can certainly choose, do we want to have coal or not have coal? There was some questions earlier about it. I would just say if you care about the climate, it's irrelevant. Whether we do more coal or do less coal doesn't have any impact on the climate, if that's what you care about. If you care about competitiveness, this is massive advantage for China. So they've done a lot of renewables, they've done a lot of nuclear, and they've done a lot of coal, because of course you need baseload to go with your intermittency. And their power markets are dominant. So the red line again is China, the black line is us. China's power market 2.5 times our size. I have this purplish, whatever color that is, pinkish, magenta line of US++. US cannot go it alone. Probably one of the things that concerns me most about the current rhetoric that we hear is that we somehow think we can. We cannot. Why would we want to? How do we team up with traditional Western European allies in Canada and Japan and all these countries who are all no more want to be dominated by China manufacturing? And if you add us together, we can actually be a formidable competitor to China. Now, the US economy is still larger than China's by a decent amount, but China's got 1.4 billion people. And we're not going to talk about immigration today, but we're at 350, 375 million people. Even if we had unbridled immigration, we're still going to be way behind them. And they've got a momentum to what they're doing. And they've got a 25 to 40% manufacturing cost advantage on lots of different things versus everybody else. We should really be concerned about their significant energy advantage that they have. And they ironically have it without having much by way of domestic resource except for coal. This is a real credit to China. There's no reason we can't be competitive. If I go back to this import line and the shale line, imagine a world where we didn't have the shale oil revolution. For the first time, the Strait of Hormuz, the closure in the Middle East, is not really going to impact us from a risk of shortages. We'll have an inflation impact. We might have a negative GDP impact, but we're not going to face shortages like Asia. Thank goodness for a whole bunch of counties in Texas and North Dakota. And these choices do matter. What if Texas was in New York State? We would have zero shale oil. How sad would that be? Right? That would be terrible. What if Texas was California? California is risk of going the way of Europe right now, of facing some real energy crisis and real shortage. That doesn't sound like a great thing. Why is it good for California to ship their jobs to China? How does that make any sense? LNG. We've gone from zero LNG exports effectively to #1 within a decade. And thank goodness for Europe we did, because when Russian gas was cut off to Europe, it was replaced by US LNG. What's a country that has very little LNG? Is Canada. Canada's chosen to be more like California, where they've got this great province of Alberta that unfortunately is landlocked. That's their choice, not me to tell Canadians what to do, but I'm just observing why would it make sense for China to restrict their natural gas and their exports? I'm going to say Canadian oil and gas is good oil and gas. I'm going to use a moral term. They've got stricter environmental regulations than we do in the US. They've got at least as tough labor standards, if not better, than us or the rest of the world. That is good oil and gas. And they made a choice to keep it within Canada. Now, they got critique from environmentalists say, oh, your carbon emissions aren't falling like you said. That's because it all comes from production. There's a need to disaggregate carbon emissions that you use in driving your cars and so forth from that which comes from production. These are should be two different things. And these choices are really relevant. Where would we be today? Maybe we wouldn't have gone to war with Iran. Maybe it would be a good thing if we didn't have this revolution. But like I say, as an American, thank goodness we had it. And I think Canada should be part of it as well. And I would note on LNG, it started under President Obama. He allowed LNG exports. It's my friend Jason Bordoff from Colombia. I'm part of his advisory board, who is his key advisor. And President Obama chose it. He's the one who allowed it. And then Trump one allowed it, and Biden allowed it to continue. A little wobbly at the end of Biden, but they allowed it to continue. And now Trump too have continued. We've gone from nowhere to number one in less than a decade. It's amazing, in LNG exports. I want to just touch upon the Strait of Hormuz situation. It is completely untenable for this strait to remain closed. And I think this audience will appreciate it. It's 20% or 50% of a whole bunch of different things: oil, products, LNG, fertilizer, helium. It is terrible for everybody for it to be closed. It's terrible for humanity, it's terrible for governments, it's terrible for businesses. It is terrible for oil and gas companies, because the only way to resolve that imbalance is to have a deep global recession worse than the global financial crisis. It is not good for oil and gas companies to have the strait closed. It has to open in some manner. The longer it lasts, the longer we're going to see some meaningful impacts. And it's pretty crazy. Sorry for the Bloomberg graphs here that can be hard to read, but we're already seeing signs of physical disruption and stress is what the spikes in the most recent period show, when it's only like right now today that the ships aren't coming to those Asian countries. It's only right now. You're already seeing dislocations like Dubai physical crude relative to Brent, or jet prices, which is the graph on the right, and contrast it with the Russia period, which is the early part of those graphs. The bottom graph would show physical versus financial market spreads. And in Russia, Ukraine, you did not see physical market disruption. This is a much, much worse situation. We worried about disruption in Europe. We had it in LNG, or natural gas, to Europe, and that was replaced by LNG, American LNG, and so we didn't have actual physical disruption. This time we're already seeing it. The strait being closed is horrific. It is worse than the global financial crisis combined with the worst of a COVID humanitarian crisis. There's nothing good about it being closed at all. It needs to reopen in some manner. The process of destroying demand, this is oil, is brutal. If you take 12 million barrels a day of flows that aren't coming out of the strait, it forces a 105 million barrel a day oil market down to 93 today. The last time we were at 93 million barrels a day of oil demand was in 2014, when global GDP was $35 trillion lower than it is today, or 30%. It is a brutal adjustment process. Again, I don't think in America we're going to see physical shortages because of not just the shale oil revolution, but also refining capacity growing and our integration with Canada. All those things are relevant. And the fact that we have oil products allowed to trade in and out of the country. But for the rest of the world, it's going to be terrible. And we're not going to be immune from the inflationary impacts. And our economy is global. We have a lot of exports that our companies do, maybe not manufacturing, but again, financial markets, technology, other things. We will suffer as Americans just not as much as Asians or Europeans. I don't know how great that is. It is a brutal process of trying to adjust demand very quickly. One of the things that will come out of this, one of the things that comes out of that basic need for economic progress, and again, if I'm India, I do not want to be importing 44.5 million barrels a day in 50 years when I'm a rich country, is all the new tech. And so we spend a lot of time on it at Veritin. New tech is good for economic growth. It can be good for America if we promote the development of these technologies. It could be good for our manufacturing competitiveness. At the bare minimum, let's at least export these technologies to folks who really need it. So we spend a lot of time on grid technologies. I do think things like VPPs and demand response and all the different acronyms around grid resiliency enhancement, one of the advantages we have versus China is we've got a lot of existing stuff. That how do you run it better? How do you get more out of it? We've not built a new refinery since 1977, as I think everybody here will know, the famous Garyville refinery, but we've grown our refining output. There are refineries that John Rockefeller started. There's no original parts still left, right? So it's refurbishment and enhancement. So the idea that we'd want to shut nuclear plants, coal plants, natural gas plants, to me does not make sense. And it was a bad policy. This policy that we're going to restrict wealth. We're going to keep people at the current level of economic well-being and close some stuff negative for our country. And I think that is one of the good things that's happening right now is the recognition. How do you make the existing stuff better? But it includes things like batteries and long-duration storage that I think the current administration should also make more of an effort to spend time on. Physical AI, robotics, automation, all technologies that we spend a lot of time on. We are excited about advanced nuclear and geothermal. I think they're still in the prove it stage. So I do hope geothermal will be able to crack the code and not just be kind of niche to some locations where it makes sense. We'll see. We're watching it closely. We have some optimism at Veritin. But I don't think it's proven yet that it can be 10 or 20 or 30% of our power mix. We're definitely not at that stage yet. It's kind of same thing with advanced nuclear. Can they really come down the cost curve? Or rather, maybe where are the locations where it makes sense? And I do think things like EVs and LNG trucks, again, if you're Asia, you're definitely going to want a diversity of things. No one's going to want to be only EVs. But as part of their mix to reduce their dependence on oil imports, it's going to be something we spend time on. And we can't forget things like copper, metals, lithium, rare earths, and critical minerals. We actually have better resource on a whole bunch of those things than just China or other countries. But we're going to have to figure out where are we going to refine this stuff. And listen, I live in a nice Wall Street suburb of New Jersey. I guarantee we're not looking to have a lithium refinery in our town. So far be it from me to say, well, my community doesn't want it, your community should have it. But there must be somewhere where we can figure out where to put this stuff. We're going to need it. We're going to need it. We're going to need this war right now. Can't build it that quickly, by the way. The war is going to be determined by China. That's crazy to think about that. Crazy. But the Strait, rearmament, China's going to have a huge impact on that. It's too late for right now. It's never too late for the next decade. We went from 2015, almost zero LNG exports, to #1 in 8 years. It is entirely doable. It's the choices we make. I would love to see Colorado gas help enable California having some sort of rebound. But that's a choice you all have to make. I went to University of Denver. My daughter goes to CU, but I'm not a Coloradan. I'm not here to tell you what you should be doing. But why can't, I'm going to call Colorado oil and gas good oil and gas. It's good oil and gas. In the same way Canada's good oil and gas. In the same way California could be good oil and gas. Or some of the new stuff. Or some of this other refining process and minerals. It had to go somewhere. Where are the industrial zones that exist? Maybe that is where existing coal plants are. There are definitely parts along Long Beach and various parts of California that are industrial facilities. Look at some of the oldest refineries. How do you figure out how to repurpose some of these things if some of the old uses no longer exist? It's really one of the critical questions. I think just the final point I want to mention on sustainability is I think all the virtue signaling and climate is all that matters. That's out. And I'm going to say it's not coming back. I think net zero was the aberration. I think it was born in 2015. It came about during a period where shale was in oversupply, profitability for traditional energy was poor, so Wall Street naturally had the sector out of favor, and people just wanted to go with it. There's no basis in math for anything remotely resembling a, quote, net zero scenario. That is not the same thing as saying, what are the things we should be doing? And so my comment to all companies is, pendulum swing. I think if you didn't like the Biden or Obama methane rules, what rules would you like, and how do you get it done with an administration that presumably favors you more than what might come in 2.5 to 6.5 years, or 10.5 years? We're not going to have permanent Republican rule for the rest of the time, for sure, right? So what do you want to do? Right? How do you make that happen and have it make it last? What are the things this industry should be doing? So my view isn't that there's no room for improvement. There's plenty of room for improvement. How do you bridge the gap between what large companies do? They have more resources. They can deal with bureaucracy and regulation better, versus what can often seem like pushback, especially at a place like the API from smaller companies. What is the role for midstream in all this? It can't be good that if you said I'm not going to flare when there's a disruption, you then shut in your well and then someone else gets your pipeline space. That can't make sense. I tell my friends, yeah, why don't you go yell at some more midstream companies? Why are you always yelling at the big guys? Go yell at some midstream companies. So I don't have all the answers. But I am pro-growth. I am pro-economic growth. We should be maximizing oil, maximizing natural gas, maximizing coal, in my opinion, though I don't think I'm going to win on that one, maximizing nuclear, maximizing the new technologies, and we should be trying to improve our economy with less usage relative to that unit GDP. So I support vehicle weight restrictions as an example. I don't personally drive an SUV, though probably not this part of the country to be arguing against vehicle weight restrictions is my guess. We'll save that for my East Coast friends. My point is simply, what are the things we should be doing? And it's not nothing. I've always been impressed as a Wall Street person that every oil and gas company, they start with the safety briefing. And I believe it. I now hold a railing every time I walk down steps because Dominic Macklin at Conoco yelled at me on a platform, like, Arjun, give your director, you got to hold this railing. And this is not funny. I had a friend of my age who died falling down steps in a New York restaurant. It's very sad. I try not to end on a dour note. But I always think of Dominic, who's like, you got to hold the railing. I don't care who you are, you're holding the railing, right? And that safety mindset is my point. What part of environmental stuff fits into that? That same mindset that we're not going to compromise on it. And I don't have the answer. I think methane is one of those things. It could be some different things. What fits into that bucket? There has been an issue with a lack of diversity of opinions in the C-suite. Every shale oil and gas company had the same well IRR model that promised 30, 50, 100% rates of return and generated zero. How is there no pushback from anyone? I would say, does every company need a New Jersey heritage, ex-Wall Street analyst on their board? Maybe. But how do you create debate and discussion? That is what you need. And then the last thing, I think every investor certainly cares about governance. So there is merit to what we have called ESG. I think it went way too far. It was never going to be a basis for investment. On the other hand, I don't subscribe to the anti-ESG sentiment that we hear today as well. So I think I used far more time than I told Kirby I was going to use. I appreciate all your listening. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
All right, that was fabulous. So much appreciated. So we've got plenty of time for Q&A. Just to help you all out a little bit, we're going to do some roving mics for Arjun's Q&A. So if anybody has a question, you can either go to one of these mics over here, or you can raise your hand, and we'll bring one to you. We've got a question right over there to start.
Carmia Woolley with BLM. Thank you so much for your presentation. So you primarily spoke about supply and demand, and one of those basic units of that is people, population. Can you please speak to populations and migration?
And just if I understand your question, is it about having enough of a population to generate both demand and to enable supply, or something slightly different?
I guess that would be baseline, and then your assumptions for the projections.
I mean, so again, my background has been more through analyzing, covering oil and gas companies, and I can tell you throughout my career, one of the things you always hear is about the graying of the industry and who's going to replace the current workers. Yet we have over my 35-year career, and again, people are worried about it. I think energy, broadly speaking, is a great industry to work in. I think one of the challenges, again, this could be more of an oil and gas challenge, is it's so concentrated in Texas, and especially Houston now, that people in New Jersey and New York and California, I think, don't really understand the industry and don't realize how you can have great careers in it. So I think there's a huge opportunity for employment. In terms of immigration, I will say this: every country benefits from population growth. The question is how you get it. Do you get it through a very robust legal immigration policy or not? Definitely for another speaker to address how to reform our immigration policy. I support, in the same way, if I say I support maximum, I'll give you an answer. If I support maximum oil, natural gas, coal, nuclear, solar, batteries, et cetera, I would support maximum legal population immigration. I think more people is better. It could be legally. My personal opinion should be legal. My parents came legally. My parents actually came as students. They weren't allowed to stay. They went back to India. And then a professor said, hey, Lyndon Johnson just changed a rule. I can sponsor you to come back. And they hit on it. So they are lifelong Democrats and believe Lyndon Johnson let them into the country. No parents are perfect, right? No parents are perfect. But they believe Lyndon Johnson. They came legally. Now, different people made different choices. Definitely, I'm not the right person to be either judging them or saying this or that should happen. I will say having population growth correlates extremely well with economic growth. So if we want to have a growing economy, you're going to need people to fund it. Now, there's a role for robotics. There's a role for AI. I personally think those are being overhyped right now as job killers. Maybe you don't want to be a coder. I agree with that. In the same way, you might not want to be a chess master. Another thing that computers do very well at. But I don't know they're going to be great at sort of really pumping oil and gas out of the ground or developing the new battery storage breakthrough. They might assist with it, but they're not going to make it. Be a person that makes the battery storage breakthrough, as an example. It was Elon Musk who said, I don't want a compliance car. I want a really cool car that rich people want to drive. And that's going to be the road to penetrating, making EVs like a real thing. So I don't really know if that answered your question or not, but I do support more people in our country.
Thank you.
Yes. I can repeat your question. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Julie Mullica, Adams County Commissioner. Thank you so much for your presentation. This has been fantastic. One of the things that I was struggling with during your conversation is the idea, and thank you for laying it out clearly, the idea that net zero isn't real, or like not something that we could really achieve. Yep. Unfortunately, I come from a place that is very blue, and that my residents still believe that that is the way that we should be going as a county and as a state. So as a policymaker, what are some things that I need to be thinking about threading the needle between both obviously having and meeting our energy demands, which are significant in Adams County, while also kind of threading the needle of, you know, those climate goals that people, frankly, are just not really going to get away from anytime soon, unless that narrative changes, you know, somewhere at a national level. Like, so I'm kind of stuck between these two things. And how do we move forward? And how can local governments help shape what this next governor is going to do? Because his approach is going to be really important in the direction that Colorado takes.
It is such a great question. And I guarantee I'm going to have zero answers for you. So I'd say this, but I can talk, so I will do that for a little bit. And hopefully I can talk in an entertaining manner, and then it'll be fine. I want to be very clear on what's not attainable. The net zero by 2050 math is not attainable. It never was. The assumptions are simply ludicrous. It's not even a close call. I'm going to take as a given to your constituents that someday we do want to not have carbon emissions on a net basis. Realistically, we don't know what decade that's going to be. What I will say is some of the accelerants today is this war in Iran. And the longer it is not a 5-day war where we just get rid of one Ayatollah and have some presumably friendly person in place, to the extent that is obviously not happening, you're going to see max effort on especially the part of Asian countries to crack the code on what comes next. And the crack the code is not one thing. You look at how far down the cost curve China's come on making electric vehicles affordable. And some will say, well, they're subsidizing this stuff. Okay, so why not? Then do that. You know, I mean, and I don't think you can subsidize your way to true economics, and I don't think they can either, but they did massively ramp up coal. So if you want more electric vehicles, that's the argument to actually having the lowest cost form of baseload power you have, of which it might be coal. Coal has become a 4-letter word. Ironically, it is 4 letters. That's the irony of it. That is the real irony of the situation. But a modern coal plant is, in a blue county, you're not having a new coal plant. I get it. By the way, in a red county, you're probably not having it either, just for the record. You're going to need really inexpensive power. And that is never going to be just solar and batteries, probably not in Colorado. So if it's not coal that you don't want, it might be nuclear, and that's probably going to be more expensive. But once it's up and running, your marginal costs are really low. But it's this notion of choice. You know, blue people driving Rivians is an affront to logic. There is nothing, you know, I was with an environmentalist where I was like, and you should ban EV SUV tax credits. Right, let's be very clear here. Maybe you support a Model 3 or, you know, a Prius or something. Those are actually probably environmentally friendly, but not in a Rivian. This guy was like, hey, I drive a Rivian. I was like, you're not a good environmentalist, buddy, you know? And it was a leading environmentalist. People would sort of recognize the person's name. What is the construct to having inexpensive power would be number one. And I think what can be really hard in blue communities is it's the argument like if you don't do it there, it's going to be done elsewhere. And that feels a little bit like whataboutism. But are you able to make, so farm to table is like a popular thing. We do that in New Jersey, farm to table, right? Hey, that farm down the street, we're eating that, you know, that killed cow, right? It's all good. Why doesn't it apply to manufacturing? Why doesn't farm to table apply to, you know, why shouldn't it be Coloradans working? I have no doubt that blue community is going to have stronger labor and environmental rules than perhaps even Midland, Texas is going to have, as an example. And certainly better than China, Iran, or so forth. So I think it's how do we get a farm-to-table concept for everything else? And so maybe realistically, you're not going to have a coal plant. You don't live, I think, in a climate where you can have solar as your base load supply. You definitely have a lot of very inexpensive, you're in the Piceance Basin, for God's sakes, right? Or maybe you're not, but we are in the Piceance Basin. And that is very inexpensive. So it's really hard for politicians to tell nuanced observations about energy, no less, to their citizens. It definitely is not vote winning. And that's why Republicans have their own version of stupid policies that I don't agree with. Both sides suck, excuse me, right? I really believe that. Energy policy is inherently long-term in nature. It's decadal in nature. And it's very hard for people to think, but farm to table for manufacturing, maybe that's the best answer I can give you. Welcome.
I think Commissioner Duran-Mullica might have kind of stolen my question. I'm over here. Sorry.
Oh, yes.
There's a narrative in the media, national media right now, that this oil shock and this is actually going to press the U.S., but particularly Europe and others, closer to renewables for national security. Do you see that happening? Do you see any opportunity? You mentioned China and India have done it for national security reasons too. You don't want to import, but do you see that this affecting a shift towards renewables for certain markets?
So I agree with the question in part, or I agree with that commentary in part, which is the case. The best case for renewables is that you may not love that slave labor in China, the Uyghur population, made that panels. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but you may not like it. You may like it, you may not like it. You probably don't like it. But once the panel's in your country, we're going to put aside that part of it. Once the panel's up in your country, it's a domestic source, the sun coming in. And so then where do you get good solar radiation and where do you not, right? So what's the most you could have of solar plus batteries? It's not a set answer. It's going to change as technology evolves. To have a reliable 24/7 and affordable grid that is geopolitically secure ideally. That's what you're kind of solving for. What I'm going to warn about in this upcoming video is net zero rebranded, which is, okay, we know the net zero wasn't popular, so we're going to say the same things, but call it geopolitical security. And I want to be clear, there is a legitimate geopolitical security argument, as I've made in this talk, to all the non-quote fossil fuel stuff, maybe with the exception of coal, because coal tends to be abundant in some of these developing world countries. So I think there is a geopolitical argument to make. But when Europe has decided to shut in a bunch of their nuclear plants, and we're trying to do the work on how comebackable is the German nuclear, can Germany bring back online the ones they shut in, or how quickly they can, same with Japan. It's work we're trying to understand right now. What's going to be their source? The real lesson of Japan was atomically bombed in 1945. And by the late 80s, they were buying properties in Rockefeller Center, causing an outrage amongst Americans about how wealthy Japan was. That's an incredible success story. There's a lot we could all benefit from studying Japan, from going from not just poor, but devastated. Yeah, India's poor. Japan was devastated to being the world's top economy by the time you got to the late 80s, 1990s. Part of it was energy diversification. And part of it was they did import coal, and they did nuclear, and they did LNG. Those weren't necessarily the lowest cost options, but enabled economic growth, and they bought it from enough different places. And so solar and battery storage and these things and renewables broadly absolutely have a role in it. I do not agree with this administration canceling offshore wind leases where the permits were mostly done. That's not a good thing. I don't think any oil and gas company was in favor of that for the same reason they know it's going to come back to bite them. But I would argue oil and gas should stand up and say, killing projects when the permits are in are bad for everybody. And they say it privately, they don't say it publicly. Right? That's an example of where the rhetoric could be better. We really think, we may not like the Equinor project, we may think it's a dumb project, or maybe it's not a dumb project, but the permits were in place. You can't cancel the project at that stage. There's no answer. And I do think the net zero folks are going to say, now renewables are the answer for this different reason. It is a component. It's a component to being geopolitically secure. I think there is drilling that UK can do for natural gas in the North Sea, especially in Norway. They may choose to do it. They may choose not to do it. Nuclear should be part of their mix. Coal should really be part. Europe should follow the China strategy. Max coal, max renewables. And they're only going to do half of it. When you do half of it, what you end up with is a slowly deteriorating population, economic situation. No one is guaranteed to be wealthy forever. Look at Argentina 100 years ago. Look at China 300 years ago. Right? Countries, our success as a country is not just a birthright. I'm super lucky to be born here. We cannot take it for granted. I pray every day we do not go the way of Western Europe. I mean that very seriously, right? I don't want to just go to a place that's not a place to vacation. You want a thriving economy, you need jobs. And if you don't want them in Colorado or California, then or New Jersey, I'll pick on my own state, then thank goodness they're in Texas, and maybe Florida, and maybe Louisiana. So I'd just be careful of net zero rebranded. Renewables are absolutely going to be part of the mix, but then what are the other power options that make sense for that region? And for Europe, it is actually going to be coal, do it with modern coal plants, and it's probably going to be nuclear. Thank you for your question.
Arjun, Ryan Zorn from Liberty. I've got to ask about, a question related to energy poverty. Given the multiples of energy growth that we need to serve the needs of the 7 billion, what do you see in terms of our ability to export our shale technology around the world? I mean, it seems like those governments have to be watching what's happened, in our own energy trade balances, but, we are dominant exporter now. And to the extent that they don't want to become more dependent on us, what can they do internally in their countries? And I'm thinking about private property rights and fiscal terms that really meet the needs of a sort of an unconventional development strategy. Just curious on your perspective there.
I think the second part of it's a great question, Ryan. I think, we're not the only country. I mean, the U.S. is now by far the largest oil producer and natural gas producer, and we don't necessarily have the most resources of any country. It is the foundation of our country. People came, mostly from Europe, and they settled, and in exchange for settling, they got the mineral and land rights. That was like a key thing that was enabled at the start of our country that has enabled the shale revolution today that for the most part doesn't exist in the entire rest of the world. By and large, the federal governments of the other countries own their resources, their land rights, and especially the mineral rights underneath it. And as a result, you don't have the highly competitive incentive of landowners and lots of different companies competing over extracting and generating. And we reward, generally, it's looked favorably upon to move up, to live the American dream. My parents came with $25. I'm a retired government partner. Like, that's the American dream, right? My father became the dean of Harvard Engineering as someone who originally was not allowed to stay in the country. It's unbelievable, right? And so we have that here. You don't have it everywhere else. I think there are some signs of life for shale in Argentina, as I know you know, Ryan, and in a few other places. But I think the big challenge with the rest of the world is it's in the rest of the world. And it's not in America. And they don't have what has historically made this country great that we cannot forget.
Okay, we don't want to run you over. I know you've got somewhere to go.
Yeah.
Did you have time for another question, or should we call that?
We could do one more question, sure.
Does anybody have one more question?
Right here?
Right here. Take my microphone.
Thanks for the opportunity to ask a question. I don't want to leave you hanging when you baited questions there. I really appreciated what you said about it being a luxury to have the debate about energy choice and net zero. And if it's not on a timeline, great. Perhaps it's a goalpost that's continually moving. Yep. If that, in fact, is an inhibitor of GDP growth and correspondingly wealth creation, either domestically or abroad, or there's some trade that enhances both parties, presumably. Yep. It's been very hard to price. And if we can't price it, can we price it based on the marginal loss of GDP when you make that trade-off to put a new constraint on energy production or put a new cost on energy production? Because if it is truly impeding growth and value creation, either here or the world or both, that seems like something we could price. And if you go to these counties that are struggling with this debate, can we be net zero and profitable? Yeah. Put a caliper on it. And if so, if that works, why has it been so hard here and abroad?
It's such a great question, Greg. And I would personally be very sympathetic in terms of if we think emissions are a problem, put a price on carbon. There's a lot of theoretical frameworks of how do you price externalities that have not won the day for sure. And it is, in fact, in the United States, strong blue counties that seem to be as opposed to a, quote, carbon tax as any red company. And you have the odd thing where major oil company CEOs support, say, a carbon tax, which isn't exactly what you asked for, but these theoretical frameworks. There's something about that I think I've come to appreciate, that a Wall Street analyst is going to really say, hey, that's actually a great idea. I love it. That does not sell at the local level or the state level or even the federal level. And so I think this is where folks like myself, we can articulate how miraculous the shale oil revolution has been, how important our imports are. I think we can look at the fact that Europe's been basically saved by LNG exports, and honestly, Canada did nothing. Canada chose to keep it to themselves. Now, they made that choice. They're welcome to make that choice. And it had a different set of consequences. How do you get all that out there so you can get different constituencies together? I imagine this kind of conference is a step in the right direction. I try and engage with as many different people as possible. But I think that's sort of the political economy aspect of economy. That's a really tough one. I'm always grateful that I'm not in the political sphere and that I'm like a Wall Street person for sure. Or that I get to deal with energy companies, which are a really fun group to deal with across the spectrum. I don't know how you convince, people. I had a good conversation last night. Like the data center making a humming noise, that does seem like really bad. Or if they're taking your water, or people are not articulating why it's not going to drive up their electricity rates, or maybe it is, depending on whether you're a regulated or non-regulated state. There's a lot of those kind of things that I get. But the world is better off with American economy being good. It's better off with Americans will be better off with more manufacturing here. And I don't think there are any clear-cut answers that I actually have to how you solve these tough challenges. So thank you, Greg. Thank you, Kirby. It's been a real honor and a pleasure to be here.
Is that a great big hand for Arjun? Appreciate it. That was fabulous.